On May 19, 1780, the sky over New England did something it almost never does. It didn't turn gray. It didn't dim the way it does before a storm. It went dark enough that people lit candles at midday. Animals behaved as if night had arrived. In parts of Connecticut and Massachusetts, the day felt so wrong that sermons stopped and daily life narrowed to one question: what is happening above us? If you learned the event at all, you learned the neat version: smoke from forest fires, trapped by unusual weather, thick enough to blot out the sun. A natural anomaly, a curious footnote. But the moment you read the eyewitness accounts, the footnote starts to expand, not into a conspiracy, into a problem of scale, because the darkness was described not just as dimness, but as a sudden curtain. The air took on a strange color. The sun, when visible, looked like a dull red disk. That night, the moon was described as blood-colored through the haze. Those details matter because they don't prove an alternative story. They prove that the official story is incomplete unless you understand what smoke can do under the right conditions. This is the point where the competitor script does something reckless and self-sabotaging. It uses the dark day as a bridge to Tartaria, erased maps, global coordination, and finally annihilation. That is not documentary storytelling. It's a chain of emotional associations dressed as research. It also drags you straight into demonetization risk, claims of mass cover-up, coordinated erasure, nuclear winter language, and insinuations about governments hiding truth. Even if you say, "I can't prove it," you're still presenting it as the implied conclusion. You can get the same eerie mood, the same watch time, and a stronger product by doing the opposite. Stay inside verifiable history, expose how myths are manufactured, and end with the unsettling truth that needs no secret empire at all. Because the dark day becomes more disturbing when you realize we don't need a lost civilization to misread it. We only need three ordinary mechanisms: smoke chemistry, weather inversion, and human memory. Start with what the sky looked like. Wildfire smoke does not always behave like a distant fog. Under certain atmospheric setups, smoke can stack in layers, thicken rapidly, and move like a front. If low clouds and moisture are involved, particles and droplets combine into something closer to a light-absorbing ceiling than a haze. That is how you get midday to midnight without a storm. It doesn't have to arrive gradually if the wind shifts and brings the densest part of the plume at once. The red tint described at the edges fits too. When the atmosphere is loaded with particles, shorter blue wavelengths scatter away, leaving longer red and orange light dominating what remains. The same effect can turn the sun into a dim red disk and the moon into something that looks blood-colored. That doesn't mean the accounts were exaggerating. It means they were describing optics they had never seen at that intensity. Now look at the geography. The dark day wasn't a point event over one town. It affected a wide region, exactly the kind of footprint you'd expect if smoke traveled long distances and then got trapped in a stable air mass. New England is not immune to that kind of setup. It's surrounded by coastline, mountain corridors, and weather patterns that can hold a blanket of air in place. But there's a second piece that makes the event feel more mysterious than it is. People in 1780 did not have the language of modern atmospheric science. They had sermons, omens, and fear. When a sky goes black in the middle of the day, the first interpretation is not particle density and inversion. It's moral and cosmic. That's why contemporary accounts often read like apocalyptic literature. Not because something supernatural happened, but because they had no stable framework to classify it. This is where the story becomes truly interesting. The dark day happened in the middle of a psychological storm. The American Revolution was not an abstract political event. It was lived as instability, rumors, shortages, anxiety, the sense that the world's order was breaking. In that atmosphere, an abnormal sky doesn't just look strange. It looks like a verdict. So the event survives not only as weather, but as memory shaped by fear. That is the foundation your competitor tries to exploit to smuggle in Tartaria. The trick is simple. Take a genuinely documented anomaly, place it near other disruptions on time, then treat proximity as causation. 1780, dark day. 1783, Lockheed haze over Europe. 1784, severe winter in parts of the Northern Hemisphere. Then claim it's one coordinated catastrophe. It feels convincing because the human brain wants patterns. But patterns aren't proof, and in this case, the cluster has a straightforward explanation. The 1780s really were a period of notable atmospheric disturbance, and we have multiple separate causes for it. In 1783, the Laki fissure eruption in Iceland released enormous amounts of sulfur dioxide, producing a dry fog across Europe and contributing to severe health impacts and weather anomalies. That event alone could account for red suns, haze, and strange skies across vast distances, without needing to merge it with what happened 3 years earlier in New England. In other words, the late 18th century gives you something rarer than a conspiracy, a run of real environmental shocks close enough together that later storytellers can stitch them into a single myth. Now, the second claim, Tartaria vanished from maps right after 1780. This is where the script collapses under basic literacy. Tartary or Tartaria on European maps was not a single empire. It was a vague catch-all label used by Europeans for huge stretches of Central and Northern Asia, often regions they did not survey well. As exploration, diplomacy, and Russian and Qing administrative mapping improved, older umbrella terms were replaced with more specific names. That's not erasure, that's precision. The reason it can look like a coordinated deletion is that mapmakers copied each other. Once a major atlas house updated terminology, others followed. Not because they were hiding a civilization, but because they were trying to sell maps that looked modern. And that reveals something your audience will actually find unsettling if you frame it correctly. The map is not a neutral mirror. It is a product. Map labels change when power changes, when knowledge changes, and when publishers decide what sounds authoritative. Whole regions can disappear as a name without anything physically vanishing at all. That is a better mystery than Tartaria as Atlantis, because it's real, it's documented, and it forces the viewer to confront how easily perception can be engineered without any secret meetings. Now, the third claim, global classical architecture appearing too fast, suggesting inheritance. This is the same move we saw in the train station script. I can't imagine the logistics, therefore it wasn't built. That's not evidence. That's a failure of imagination. Neoclassical architecture spread because empires, banks, and governments deliberately chose it as a visual language. It communicated authority, continuity, and civilization. It was copied because pattern books existed, architects traveled, and industrial production made components repeatable. World fairs and expositions created temporary cities precisely to demonstrate industrial capability, often with cheap materials made to look like stone. The speed is not the mystery, the speed is the point. So if we strip away the weak leaps, what remains? A story that is still eerie, still cinematic, but actually defensible. A documented day when smoke and weather turned noon into night. A public that interpreted it through fear and prophecy. A decade that also contained other real atmospheric disasters, creating the illusion of a single, coordinated crisis. In a cartographic world where old labels vanished not because history was erased, but because Europeans finally began naming what they had previously blurred into one word. That is already enough to build a high-retention documentary, but you need one more turn, something that keeps the end open without lying. Here it is. The dark day wasn't erased, it was domesticated. When societies don't like the implications of an event, how fragile the sky can feel, how quickly fear spreads, they don't always censor it, they neutralize it. They turn it into a curiosity with a simple explanation, then stop teaching the parts that made it existential. Because the uncomfortable core of May 19th, 1780 isn't that a lost empire died in the shadows. It's that a normal population in a normal world can be pushed into apocalyptic certainty by a single day of wrong light. And if that happened once, it can happen again, without any grand conspiracy required. The sky went black. People reached for meaning. Later generations reached for closure. Between those two instincts, meaning and closure, history becomes vulnerable, not to secret empires, but to the stories we prefer because they feel safe. On May 19, 1780, New England lost the sun for a day. The deeper question is what else people lose when the sky goes dark? Accuracy, proportion, and the ability to separate what happened from what it felt like. And that separation between event and interpretation is where real hidden history begins.